In 1904, St. Louis, Missouri would be host to both the Summer Olympics and the St. Louis World Fair. While the Olympics usually seems like a well-run and fairly respectable institution, the 1904 Olympics had one event go completely off the rails. This is a brief history of the 1904 Olympic Marathon. In this episode, I have built a small park area with a dirt running path, inspired by the story behind the 1904 Olympic Marathon. This build is not based on any reference photos. Held in St. Louis, Missouri, the 1904 Olympics would be the first held in the United States, in the same location and year as the upcoming World Fair, which was celebrating the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase. The United States were pushing for victory at the Olympics, and their 5 marathon runners were experienced marathoners who were favorites to win the event. On the other hand, many other countries sent assorted folks with varying degrees of experience in running and marathons in general. Notably, Greece sent 10 men who had never run a marathon before. South Africa didn't send anyone for the marathon, but 2 men, Len Tao and Jan Masciani, happened to be in St. Louis as part of the South African exhibit at the World's Fair and decided they would try to run the marathon. One of these men did so barefoot. One of the stranger runners, though, was Felix Carbajal, a Cuban national and former mailman who raised money to come to the Olympic Games by running from one side of Cuba to the next, collecting donations. Once in the United States, Felix stopped in New Orleans and promptly lost all of his money gambling, forcing him to hitchhike the rest of the way to St. Louis, Missouri. With no way to afford anything due to the loss of his money, Felix arrived at the starting line looking as dapper as ever in his long-sleeve shirt, dark trousers, street shoes, and beret. Luckily for Felix, a kind-hearted fellow runner took pity on him and cut Felix's trouser from the knee down before the race began. Typically, marathons begin in the morning due to the cooler weather, but the 1904 marathon began promptly at 3 p.m., when the heat had already reached 90 degrees. The marathon began with 5 loops of the stadium track, but was then followed with a miles-long journey across windy, dusty roads, with race officials in vehicles both in front of and behind the runners, kicking up dust clouds into the runner's face for most of the race. Despite the heat and dust, race officials only set up 2 water spots, one at 6 miles into the race and the final 12 miles into the race, leaving runners to run a full 12 miles in the scorching heat, coughing up dust before being able to finish. But of course, the water stops had to just be a stupid mistake. Why would they choose to let their runners suffer and potentially be harmed or killed? The chief organizer of the games, James Sullivan, was particularly interested in research regarding the effects of purposeful dehydration, and ordered officials to minimize water intake at all costs during the marathon. The water stops, however, were one of the least ridiculous things to happen during this marathon. A total of around 32 runners began the marathon, and it quickly spun out of control. One of the runners from the United States, William Garcia, collapsed on the side of the road and ended up hospitalized with hemorrhaging. It was found later that dust from the track had coated his esophagus and ripped apart his stomach lining. He did survive his injuries. Another runner, John Lorden, vomited on the side of the track and decided to give up entirely. One of the runners from South Africa was unfortunate enough to be chased off the track by wild dogs. Our postman friend Felix, who had joined the race at the last minute, seemed to be having the time of his life trotting along the path and chose to stop and chat with spectators during his run. One group of spectators he stopped to chat with were eating peaches, and he asked them if he could have one. He was denied, but he stole 2 peaches from them and ran off with his fruit. Still hungry later in the race, Felix saw an apple orchard on the side of the path and decided to stop off and have some apples. Unfortunately, the apples did turn out to be rotten and gave Felix horrible stomach pains. He chose to sleep it off on the side of the track. He would eventually go on to finish in 4th place and would have won if he hadn't taken an hour-long nap along the side of the course. At this point, 2 of the American runners, Sam Mellor and Fred Lors, were in the lead. But Mellor was soon struck down with stomach cramps. likely from the dehydration. And though he tried to trudge on, he eventually gave up and left the race, leaving Lors in the lead. Around the 9-mile mark of the race, Lors began suffering stomach cramps as well, and decided to leave the race. He hopped into a car and waved at his fellow runners as he was chauffeured back to the stadium. This left American Thomas Hicks in the lead, who by mile 10 was begging his support crew for even a drop of water. The support crew refused to give him water, but were kind enough to sponge his mouth out with warm distilled water, until they began doping him a few miles later with a combination of strychnine, a stimulant, and egg whites. It was the 1904 Olympics. There were no rules about performance-enhancing drugs, so this was entirely allowed. It was around the time that Hicks was being doped by his handlers that Fred Lors decided that his cramps weren't so bad, so he asked the car driving him to pull over, and he simply rejoined the race, despite protests from Hicks' support staff. Lors managed to cross the finish line first to overwhelming cheers, and was about to have the gold medal placed around his neck when someone in the audience cried out that he was an imposter. Lors, of course, played it off as a joke, saying he never intended on accepting the medal, he just thought it would be funny. Hicks was still running and began to give up at the sound of Lors' victory, but perked up as much as he could when he heard Lors had been disqualified. His support staff doped him up again, but were kind enough to allow him to wash the strychnine down with brandy. In the last mile, Hicks began to hallucinate and beg his support staff for both food and rest. They appropriately gave him more brandy and some egg whites before carrying him over the finish line while he moved his feet to give himself the illusion of running. Hicks was declared the winner of the event, and it was later noted that he lost 8 pounds during the race. It's not a diet I would suggest. Out of the 30 or so men who started in the 1904 Olympic Marathon, only 15 eventually finished the race. After the absurdity of this marathon, the event was almost removed from the Olympics entirely. Thankfully, the marathon event was saved, and it is unlikely we will ever see such a spectacle during the Games again. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Brief History. I hope you enjoyed this story as much as I did. Every time I see this one, it's just so absurd, and I can't believe it's true, but it is true. And if you do have any weird, wacky, or strange historical events you would like to see covered in this series, I would love to do more, so please leave them in a comment down below. Thank you to my patrons who support this series. You are so much appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Bye!